And good morning, folks. Today we are going to begin our look at the very last topic in the course, which is forgiveness. Just as a quick note or two, the final exam in this course, of course, is next Thursday. Next Thursday, that's right. And it will occupy the first 2 hours, and then there will be nothing after that, of course, because the course will be over. We will not be meeting on Tuesday next week, because we will finish the course either today or possibly on this coming Thursday. And I'll post a note to that effect on the website as well, just to make sure everybody knows. I will be posting within the next day or so general information about the final exam coverage. It is or will be 80 multiple choice questions, for which you will have 2 hours. And it will cover, with respect to lecture material, it will be cumulative. We'll cover everything from the very first class to whenever we finish this topic. With respect to, and there will also be, as usual, 8 to 10 questions drawn from the text readings, but in that case, the text questions are not cumulative. They'll be drawn only from the readings assigned since the second midterm. And I'll specify exactly what those areas are, because, of course, they include everything after self-efficacy and self-esteem, plus the material we're covering today. I think that's pretty much it. So any questions about the final exam? Yeah. I will let you know. It's usually about 50-50, roughly. Old, quote-unquote, material versus new. It may be a little more old than new this time, because we covered so much on the first 2 midterms. But I'll give you a rough percentage breakdown of where the lecture questions will come from in my posting in the next, as I said, day or so. Any other questions or comments? Okie dokie. All right. So our last topic in the course is forgiveness. I don't know that there is a religious tradition that does not recognize at least the moral value of forgiveness. Certainly all of the Eastern traditions do. There's no question about that. And Buddhism, Hinduism, and so on. In the West, there is an interesting mix. In both Judaism and and to some degree in Christianity and Islam, there is the value of forgiveness is recognized. I mean, it occurs in several places in the Quran. It occurs certainly in the Gospels in the New Testament. With respect to the Judeo-Christian heritage, there is a mix. On the one hand, forgiveness is recognized as having value, moral value. On the other hand, so is revenge. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, of course, in the Old Testament. Even though, interestingly enough, the state of Israel has almost never imposes the death penalty, even though, of course, it would be recognized for, I think, 20 or 30 different crimes in the Jewish literature. But in Christianity, of course, we don't see much about, I don't think we see anything about revenge. And forgiveness is specifically mentioned in several places. I mean, the Lord's Prayer contains the line, "Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us," and so on. So it's recognized certainly within the religious traditions as a moral value, and it's becoming more and more recognized within the positive psychology tradition as not so much a moral value, but a personal value. That is, it contributes positively to the well-being of not only the person who's forgiven, but more interestingly and more especially the forgiver, him or herself, also benefits. And we'll see, I'll briefly look at a little bit of that literature as we move along. When someone has done something to wrong us, one of our very first human emotions is anger and a desire for retribution and revenge. And it's very difficult in many cases for us to find it in our hearts to forgive someone who has done something bad to us, and especially as the magnitude of that transgression increases. And so there have been a number of very dramatic cases in which forgiveness seemed unlikely, and yet it was given. And these cases are so, what shall I say, compelling, I guess, to us, that they have, in many cases, made headlines across, well, in some cases across the world, but certainly across North America. I want to mention 2 or 3 of these. One of the more recent ones occurred, I guess, in 2002 or 10. Anyway, it concerns this woman here, Jennifer. What's her name? Jennifer Thompson. In 1984, she was a young college student living on her own in somewhere in North Carolina, and she awoke in her bedroom one night to find a young black man on top of her, raping her. She decided, probably wisely, not to fight back, but she worked very hard to memorize all of the features of this individual so that she could readily identify him when and if he was caught. And once he left and she escaped, she sought out the police immediately and provided a rather detailed description, a drawing as it happened, of the individual that had been responsible for her rape. Based on that description, the police arrested a young man named Ronald Cotton. And he was dutifully brought to trial, and based largely on Jennifer Thompson's highly certain, highly confident identification of him, he was convicted of the rape, not only of her, but I think of another woman that same night, as a matter of fact. Now, 1984 was prior to the era of DNA identification. DNA identification in criminal trials didn't really start until the late 1980s. I think the very first case of DNA use was in the mid-1980s. In 1995, I think it was, or later, they finally tested the DNA rape kit that they had taken from Jennifer Thompson and determined conclusively that Ronald Cotton was not the perpetrator at all, even though he'd been identified conclusively by Jennifer Thompson. By this time, Jennifer had married, and she was the mother of triplets, as a matter of fact, and she was devastated by the discovery that she had misidentified her attacker. And she was very concerned, and Ronald Cotton was released, of course. He was exonerated and released. And she was very concerned that he would come after her and her family to seek revenge. And so she lived in some concern for a couple of years. And then with the intervention of a clergyman, a minister of some sort, she arranged to meet Ronald Cotton in a church, at which point she was going to beg for forgiveness for having wrongfully resulted in his conviction. And the interesting thing was that before she could even ask, he voluntarily forgave her. They became quite good friends, as a matter of fact. They ended up touring the country, I think they still do occasionally, talking about wrongful convictions and the vagaries of eyewitness testimony, and together they wrote this book. Very good book, incidentally, Picking Cotton, an interesting pun in the title. And as I said, he and the Thompson family have become quite close, and they're very good friends, again because of his selfless decision to forgive her without even being asked after 11 years in prison. Another case, I'd say it in some respects equally dramatic, was the case of Eric Smallwood. One night, Eric made a very bad decision. He did too much drinking, and he decided to drive home. Got in his car and ran down 2 young women and killed them both. Megan Napier and Lisa Dixon. And he was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Began serving his sentence. And the mother of one of the girls, Renee Napier, I think it was, took it upon herself to go out and begin campaigning against drunk drivers, as you can imagine she would. And so she was, giving talks and giving presentations in a number of different places. But she vaguely felt uncomfortable. She realized that at some point she was going to have to forgive Eric Smallwood for what he had done to her family and the death of her daughter. And in fact, she did, and she petitioned the governor of the state to reduce Eric Smallwood's sentence. He had been sentenced to 20 years. He was released at her urging after 10 years. And again, they formed a partnership, and they continued to move around, mostly from high school to high school, talking about the dangers of drunk driving and so on and so forth. And again, a close relationship and friendship was formed between the two of them. There he is with her. Okay. Two more cases. This is a case that I've always thought to be the most dramatic, and I remember it vividly when it happened some years ago. I can't remember the year. I think it's in the late 90s. A very troubled young man entered a school building in the town of Nickel Mines, Pennsylvania. It's an Amish community. And there were about 25 or 30 children in the school, and he let the boys go. He kept the girls, and one by one, he executed them. Ended up, I think, executing 11 girls ranging in age between 6 and 13 years of age. After having killed them all, he killed himself. You can imagine the community's feeling. They'd lost 10 or 11 of their children to this fellow. And what was their response? Well, their response was to forgive him, which they believed their religion required. Not only did they forgive him, they were half of the mourners at his funeral. Not only did they forgive him, they paid his widow because she needed support in the absence of the breadwinner of the family. And one of the Amish members of the community said of him, he was overcome by evil, but he was not an evil man. Again, quite a dramatic case of forgiveness. And one more. I picked on this one. This is relatively recent. It's just a couple of years old, and it took place here in Ontario. And again, it involves an Amish individual, several of them. A young woman, she was 18 years of age, finished her chores at a dairy early one morning, and got in her car and headed out to go home. And the sun was in her eyes, and she did not see, as she was driving down this provincial highway, she did not see the Amish buggy in front of her. She struck it, knocked it off the road, and of the 4 individuals who were in the buggy at the time, one, an elderly man, was killed. Didn't die at the scene. He was taken to hospital and he died. And again, the community was devastated because he was a member of good standing in the church, someone who was highly respected in the community. And once again, they forgave her. And a member of the community said of this act of forgiveness, it's not something we take pride in. I don't think anybody thought that they weren't going to forgive her. It was just a mistake done by a young lady. I'm sure she wished she could go back. All right. Again, a very telling case of forgiveness. I think I have the... If you're interested in the story, it was ran in the National Post, I think. Yes. There's the URL. It's quite an interesting story about the entire episode and so on and so forth. So again, even though our initial impulses often are negative towards individuals who've wronged us, especially in cases like this where the wrong is quite substantial, the death of a loved one and so on and so forth, the argument in favor of forgiveness is made not just morally and religiously, it's made by, I think, the literature in positive psychology around this topic, which has been, I think they've been doing research on forgiveness probably since the mid-90s, roughly, early to mid-90s. So it's about a 30-year-old research tradition, and it's growing because of the increasing popularity of positive psychology since the Seligman's APA presidential year in 1999-2000. All right, so what is it we we mean by forgiveness. What are we talking about here? Well, I think we all have a sense of what forgiveness is, but the definitions provided by the prominent researchers and theorists in the field vary slightly. Certainly in one particular respect they vary, and we'll talk about that in a second. One of the earliest and most prolific of the researchers in the field is a fellow named Robert Enright. And in 1998, in a publication, he defined forgiveness this way: it's a willingness to abandon one's right to resentment, negative judgment, and indifferent behavior toward the one who unjustly hurt us, while fostering the undeserved qualities of compassion, generosity, and even love toward him or her. Now, one of the things about this particular definition of forgiveness we ought to note is it refers only to interpersonal forgiveness. It refers to our reaction to another person who has caused us some harm. That's not the only way to consider forgiveness. If we look at Laura Thompson and her group, she defines forgiveness in the following way: framing a transgression such that one's response to the transgressor, the transgression, and the sequelae of the transgression are transformed from negative to neutral or positive. The source of a transgression and the object of forgiveness may be oneself, another person or persons, or a situation that one views as being beyond anyone's control, for example, an illness or a natural disaster. And here you see the major difference we see in definitions of forgiveness. In Enright's forgiveness model, it's only other people that are these objects of forgiveness. In Thompson's model, and in the model of several other people, it can be oneself. We often are very hard on ourselves. We refuse to forgive ourselves for having done this, that, or the other thing. So we may also be objects in need of forgiveness from ourselves, as will other people, and as will circumstances or situations. Sometimes, of course, people need to forgive God for things that they believe are within his purview and out of their control entirely. And Thompson recognizes that in her definition of forgiveness. Mike McCullough has a similar kind of definition. Forgiveness reflects, he says, increases in pro-social motivation towards another. So he shares Enright's view, such that 1, there is less desire to harm the transgressing person, and 2, an increased desire to act positively towards the transgressing person. Finally, we look at the definition of June Tangney, which is a little more technical. She describes forgiveness as, quote, a cognitive affective transformation. It's a transformation of our thoughts and our feelings in which the victim makes a realistic assessment of the harm done and acknowledges the perpetrator's responsibility, but freely chooses to cancel the debt, giving up the need for revenge or deserved punishments and any quest for restitution. In forgiving, the victim overcomes his or her feelings of resentment and anger for the act. In short, by forgiving, the harmed individual essentially removed himself or herself from the victim role. And that's June Tangney's definition. Now, we also need to consider that there are several ways to look at forgiveness, as there was indeed for gratitude as well. We can think of forgiveness as a set of cognitive or overt behaviors, things we do, things we think about another individual or whatever, whoever the transgressor is. I'm going to talk about them, the transgressor, largely as individuals, even though we should understand that it can refer to situations or ourselves. So our behaviors, our cognitions, our feelings change in ways that become less negative towards the transgressing party and more pro-social. We can also, as we did with gratitude, think of forgiveness as a trait, as a characteristic that individuals have to a greater or lesser degree. There are individuals who may be more willing to, in more circumstances, be forgiving of others, whereas there are individuals who are much less likely to show forgiving responses, behaviors, and feelings in a wide variety of circumstances. So we can think of it as a trait that has different values for different individuals. We can also think of forgiveness as something that happens within cohesive social units. I mean, certainly we can easily imagine that it's easier to forgive members of our family than it is to forgive members of, say, a class, a high school class that we belong to. Easier to forgive members of that high school class than to forgive general members of the community we don't know well, and so on and so forth. So there are different levels of, there are different degrees to which we are willing to forgive depending on the relationship of the transgressing party to us. Those closer to us are more likely to be forgiven, particularly family members and so on. Those who are unrelated or more distant from us are significantly less likely to be forgiven. Now, we need to distinguish forgiveness from a number of other emotional or behavioral or cognitive states that are in some respects overlapping or could be overlapping with forgiveness but are different from it. Forgiveness is not condoning. Now, condoning is defined essentially as finding ways to justify the behavior that some other individual has engaged in or that oneself has engaged in. Right? This would be particularly true in cases where it is the self who needs forgiveness. We might conceivably, in addition to thinking about forgiveness, condone the behavior we've engaged in, finding reasons for that behavior that justify it. Right? It's also not excusing. Excusing, of course, again, it says there were circumstances which relating to the transgression that make it justifiable. Again, there are reasons for it that one can understand. Right? It's also not pardoning. Pardoning is a legal term. Pardoning is done by the justice system or by those who have control over the justice system. Right? Just this morning, I was reading in the paper that President Trump has pardoned 4 or 5 individuals who committed crimes earlier in their lives. And forgiving is not pardoning because it's a purely legal definition, and forgiving is an interpersonal state of affairs. It's also not the same as reconciliation, though reconciliation may come. It's not the same as repairing the damaged relationship between oneself and the individual who has wronged us, whoever that might be. Now, in the examples I mentioned, in several of the examples, we did see reconciliation. Jennifer Thompson and Ronald Cotton were reconciled and became, in fact, close friends, as did the fellow who ran down the 2 girls and the mother of one of those victims. But it's not the same thing. That was an additional aspect of their relationship that went beyond the forgiveness. And certainly and absolutely, it's not the same as, and should not be confused with, forgetting about it or denying that it's ever happened. Even in the presence of forgiveness, we do not forget that it has happened, or we don't forget, and we may still think about it on a number of occasions. So forgiveness is different from all of these things, although they may become, at least 1 or 2 of them may become a part of our response to the transgressing individual over time. A very interesting approach to thinking about unforgiveness and its opposite, forgiveness, is the approach of Everett Worthington. We'll run across Worthington again a little later. And Worthington puts forgiveness and unforgiveness into the context of a very big and very influential literature on stress and coping. The work on stress and coping was begun by a pair of authors, Lazarus and Folkman, way back in the early 70s, I think it began. And it essentially was about how do we conceptualize our reaction to stress? How do we conceptualize the way in which we deal with stressful situations? And they talked about the evaluation. They talked, first of all, about a cognitive evaluation of a situation. Is it something that should cause me stress? Is it a challenge? Is it a threat? And so on. And then the cognitive and emotional sequelae, the things that follow on from that assessment. And Worthington says the same thing about about unforgiveness. He says, look, first of all, if you look at the physiological reactions that people have when they have experienced a wrong, someone has done something, or the God has done something bad to them, it feels stressful. Those individuals have a sense of being stressed, and their physiological reactions also resemble very strongly the physiological reactions we see in typical stressful situations. Blood pressure goes up, heart rate goes up, EMG, electromyographic tension, muscle tension goes up, and so on. And we see increased activity in the limbic system, the amygdala in particular, which of course is the source of primarily negative emotions. And if we look at individuals who are much more likely to be forgiving, we find that that general tendency, that trait of forgiveness, is associated with generically lower levels of stress experienced by that individual. So for these reasons and others, it's useful, Worthington says, to think of our whole reaction to a wrong, this forgiveness-unforgiveness dichotomy, as falling within the context of stressful reactions to which we have to respond. Okay. All right, so basically that. Now, so what's his model like? He says, of course, it begins when someone has done something to wrong us. He says that wrong creates what he describes as a justice gap. There's a difference, a disparity between the way things ought to be, what we should have, how we, and so on, and the way things actually are as a result of the transgression that has been committed by some other individual. So there's an injustice, there's a level of injustice that's present that we find concerning. And at this point, we then begin our cognitive evaluation of the situation. And we ask ourselves essentially two things about this situation. Is it a threat? Or is it just a challenge to be dealt with? And the second thing we ask is this, if it's a threat, is this a threat that I have the capacity to cope with? Do I have the skills, the resources to deal successfully with this particular threat, or is it beyond my capacity to deal with it? So those are the two assessments that the individual makes in the context of evaluating a wrong as either a threat or a challenge. It's a threat if it is the possibility to cause us harm, and at the same time it's beyond our capacity to handle realistically. Now, so those are the two decisions we would then make. And we then undertake some sort of cognitive processing to deal with the threat or the challenge, depending which we've decided it is. If we decided it's a threat and it's beyond our capacity to cope, we're on the path that leads to unforgiveness. Right? And what we end up doing is thinking about the wrong over and over and over again, ruminating. Rumination is a classic characteristic of unforgiveness, as it is also a characteristic of depression, interestingly enough. So we begin to think about it, and we think unforgiving thoughts, hateful thoughts about the individual who has wronged us, and so on. We think about revenge. We think about staying away from the individual, severing all ties with them, and so on and so forth. And we think about ways in which we might achieve justice. We might get something, some recompense for the suffering that we've been put through as a result of this individual's action. Now, on the other hand, if we have assessed this as a challenge, something that we have the capability of dealing with, right, even though it has caused us harm, then the cognitions we go through as a consequence are different. We're not any longer thinking about revenge. We are thinking about obtaining justice, but we're thinking about it in a more positive way. And we also start dealing with the situation in terms using using techniques that we would describe collectively as problem-focused coping. Now, we've discussed this difference before between emotion-focused coping and problem-focused coping. Emotion-focused coping is simply dealing with the feelings that we have about the situation. And in almost always we mean dealing with the negative feelings we have about the situation, about the person, about ourselves, whatever it happens to be. So emotion-focused coping focuses on dealing with and mitigating the negative emotions that we feel without solving the problem. I mean, the wrong is still going to be there. Problem-focused coping, which is going to be one of the characteristics of an individual who sees this wrong as a challenge. Problem-focused coping deals with the circumstances themselves, not just with the feelings we have about it, but how can we repair this situation so that things come back closer to normal, so that the justice gap between where things should be and where things are is minimized. And one of the ways to do that, of course, is to forgive the individual who has wronged us. And so we think about that. We think about the altruistic gift. Worthing is big on talking about the altruistic gift of forgiveness. It's altruistic because it's not earned, and we do it with no obvious, clear benefit to ourselves. Although there are benefits, as we'll see, it appears to be a selfless decision to forgive someone, right? And so that's the way we go if we see things as a challenge. We'll just put these up here because I just said the same thing. And having done that, we then, hopefully, whatever we've done has to some degree reduced the justice gap. So now things are closer to being even between us and our transgressor. If it's not, then of course the process repeats itself. The individual continues to think about and evaluate the circumstances now, and thinks about ways to deal with the newly changed circumstances, and so on and so on and so forth. And it's like the reciprocal determinism model that we talked about in the case of personality. Okay, so that's Worthington's stress and coping model of forgiveness, or unforgiveness, really. Forgiveness is the bottom row, unforgiveness is the top row. Okay. And the main way of dealing with this, everybody agrees with this, and we'll see it, we'll come up with, talk about it in a couple more cases. What we need, the main feature of unforgiveness is negative emotional responses to the individual who has wronged us. And so one of the main problem-based approaches to dealing with this stressful situation is to replace the negative emotions we feel towards this individual or situation with more positive emotions. When we're talking about individuals rather than situations, with empathy and understanding and sympathy. That is, an awareness of what the other individual is feeling, an ability to share that feeling with them, and so on. Compassion, caring, concern for the other, even though they are the ones that have wronged us. And at the bottom, altruistic love. Again, this is very high on the list of things that Buddhism recommends that we deal with others. But again, it's also part of Western philosophical and religious traditions, and it comes into play here as we deal with our initially negative reactions to someone who has transgressed against us. Okay. Whenever we deal with a psychological construct, of course, one of the things we need to do is to evaluate it, to assess it, to measure it, to quantify it. We've seen that with every single characteristic we've talked about, whether it's self-esteem, gratitude, whatever. There are always instruments designed to assess whatever psychological process or situation we're dealing with, and forgiveness is no exception. There are 4 or 5 different assessment tools for assessing forgiveness. We're going to look at maybe 2. The first one I want to mention is was designed by Rick Snyder. It's called the Heartland Forgiveness Scale, HFS. Rick Snyder, incidentally, he passed away 3 or 4 years ago, but he was one of the, and still is listed as one of the co-authors of our textbook, as a matter of fact, C.R. Snyder. This is him. And so the Heartland Forgiveness Scale. It's a relatively small scale compared to others. It's 18 items, and it's a 7-choice Likert scale. And it deals with both self-forgiveness and the forgiveness of others, and situational forgiveness. So all the three possible kinds of cases in which forgiveness might be desirable are asked about in this 18-item survey. I'll show you just a small number of the items on it. It is really hard for me to accept myself once I've messed up. Obviously, this is relevant to self-forgiveness. I continue to punish someone who has done something I think is wrong. Other forgiveness. With time, I am understanding of others for the mistakes they have made. If others mistreat me, I continue to think badly of them. And finally, I eventually make peace with bad situations in my life. And that is, of course, situational forgiveness. And as I said, there are 18 of these statements to which the individual responds. And you notice that in this particular survey, we're not directing the individual's attention to any particular wrong that has been done to them, any particular situation or other or case where they feel they need self-forgiveness. We're simply asking about, if you like, trait forgiveness. What is the extent to which, in general, you tend to be forgiving of others, of circumstances, and of oneself? That differentiates, that differentiates the Heartland Forgiveness Scale from the Transgressions-Related Interpersonal Motivations Inventory TRIMS. This is a 12-item Likert scale, and this one is rating revenge and avoidance behaviors towards some individual. And in this case, the individual is asked to think of a particular transgression that they have experienced. Think about a person who has done something bad to or for or about you. And now answer the following items with respect to this individual, your reaction to this individual. And let me show you again just a few of the items here. I'll make him pay. I wish that something bad would happen to him or her. I avoid him or her. I cut off the relationship with him or her. And this is Michael McCullough's assessment tool. And again, there are 12 of these, and this is directed towards very specific real-world transgressions, not the general argument that the Heartland Forgiveness Scale is looking for. The Enright Forgiveness Inventory, the EFI, Robert Enright's, and this is the monster, 60 items in 3 20-item subscales. Each is a 6 alternative Likert scale. But the alternatives, in the other two cases, the alternatives tend to range from strongly disagree to disagree, strongly agree, right? Here, they're different. So what they do in the affect subscale is they ask the individual essentially to pick an emotion that best characterizes their response to this transgressor. So I feel blank toward him or her, and the options are warm, negative, kindness, happy, hostile, unloving, right? And there would be 6 of these in every case. For the behavior subscale, there are statements like, regarding him, I do or would, and fill in the blank with stay away, do a favor, put him down, avoid, ignore, and again, each of these comes with a numerical choice. And the cognition or thought subscale has items like, I think he or she is dreadful, loving, worthless, nice, and there would be typically, again, 6 alternatives here. And again, there are 60 items on this scale. So it's a very, very, very detailed assessment of an individual's response. And again, like TRIMS, it is directed towards a particular transgression that the individual has experienced, not the generic nature of one's forgiving tendencies, right? So this is about specific individuals. Any questions or comments so far here? Okay. Now, from the developmental perspective, we can see that our notions of forgiveness and the circumstances under which we think forgiveness is appropriate change across the lifespan. In particular, they change from early childhood to late adolescence or so. By late adolescence and early adulthood, they tend, by and large, to have firmed up and remain constant. And Robert Enright argues that we can understand the developmental course of forgiveness by tying it into Piagetian notions of stages, and specifically to Kohlberg's view of the stages of moral development. Enright believes that forgiveness is, in a very important respect, a moral judgment on our part. And so it, therefore, he believes, can be related to the several stages that Lawrence Kohlberg has hypothesized for the development of moral understanding. And let me just go through those for you. I don't know how much contact you've had with Kohlberg or that sort of development, but Kohlberg argued that there are 6 stages of moral development in 3 levels, two stages per level. There is a pre-conventional level, with 2 stages in it. There is a conventional level with 2 stages in it, and there is a post-conventional level with 2 stages in it. Now, pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional refer to the basis for our judgments about morality. Pre-conventional implies that there are no rules governing forgiveness or morality. There are other processes which determine whether or not we think behavior is correct, appropriate, moral, and so on. The conventional stage, the name conventional suggests that there are conventions, there are agreements, there are that we follow in making decisions about morality. The post-conventional stage, level, those 2 stages are based on personally selected values. They may come from the society around us, as they often do. They may be self-selected, self-generated. But our decisions about morality aren't based on the law. They aren't based on specific, what's the word I'm looking for here? Well, they are based on principles, but they're not based on conventions, agreements reached among members of society. They're based on our own personal judgments about what is appropriate or not. So let's take a look at those stages and the related beliefs about forgiveness that are associated with each of them. The first stage in the pre-conventional level is the so-called punishment and obedience stage. And what Kohlberg says about this, and Piaget said as well, is that in this stage, which should be up to maybe 3 or 4 years of age, maybe, individuals make judgments about what is right and what is wrong based on what is punished and what is rewarded. If a behavior is going to be rewarded, praised by others, it is morally right. If it is going to be denigrated, disliked by others, it is morally wrong, and that's how we make decisions. What am I going to get punished for? Well, that's bad stuff. I don't do that. What am I going to get rewarded or praised for? Those are the good things, those are the things I do. And of course, this is essentially the way in which Freud saw the formation of the superego. It was through the things that were praised and or rewarded or punished and denigrated by those around us, especially parents. Now, if we have this attitude towards moral judgments, then our view of forgiveness is that forgiveness is only appropriate after we've harmed the other individual to the same degree that we have been harmed. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Right? So they have to be punished. They have to be punished for their transgression against us, and only after that has happened is forgiveness even thinkable or appropriate. Okay? So we can call this vengeful, vengeful forgiveness, if you like. The second of the 2 pre-conventional stages is it's sometimes called the good boy, good girl substage, or the instrumental relativist. Now, I've never liked that name because it conveys no information to me whatsoever. But essentially, in the instrumental relativist stage of the pre-conventional level of moral judgment, the individual makes judgments about the goodness or badness of an act depending on whether or not that act furthers the goals of that person or of someone else whose values whose goals they value. So if it meets someone's needs, your needs or someone else's needs, then it's good. If it fails to meet those needs, then it's bad. It's unacceptable. Okay. Now, in this case, the view of forgiveness is that it's only appropriate once the individual who's wronged you has made you whole, has made restitution for the bad thing they did to you. They don't have to be punished. They just have to make you whole. They have to make sure that you no longer suffer from whatever loss was that they inflicted on you. So restitutional forgiveness. Once restitution has been made, then we can think about forgiving. So now we're in the conventional stage, conventional level. And the third and fourth stages are both in this level. The third stage is the one, it's called interpersonal concordance. And essentially, in this stage, moral judgments are based on what others around us think is appropriate. All right, there's a consensus, a concordance around the idea of what is and is not appropriately moral, acceptable behavior. And in these cases, the individual thinks that forgiveness is acceptable when society expects us to exercise it, because the expectations of others are what define morality here, and our notion of forgiveness follows that same definition. What is it that others expect? It could be our family, it could be our general society, it could be a lot of things, right? Interpersonal concordance. The fourth stage, the law and order, it's called the law and order stage. It's the second stage of the conventional level. Says that moral judgments are based on what the law permits or forbids. If the law doesn't allow it, it's morally wrong. If the law allows it, does not forbid it, it's morally acceptable. Okay, now, when we apply this to forgiveness, of course, we're not talking about the law anymore, not the civil law, the criminal law, because it says nothing whatsoever about forgiveness. We're talking about, if you like, religious law. We're talking about what the individual's religious or philosophical beliefs require of them. And we saw that in several of the examples that I gave you. The Amish examples, it's very clear that the forgiveness there was presented precisely because their religion demanded that they behave in this way. So forgiveness is appropriate when religion requires it or expects it of you. Again, it's a rule, if you like. It's a rule not established by agreement among individuals in the society. It's a rule established by the dogma of a religious community. Finally, we reach the post-conventional level, at which there are, again, two stages of moral development and two general views about, related views about forgiveness. Stage 5 is the social contract stage of moral judgment, and essentially it says the reason we do things is not because of agreements among people. We behave in ways that make sure that society functions well, that promote peace, harmony, and goodwill among men. Right? These are the values that define the way in which we make moral judgments. What is a moral good? It's something which promotes peace, harmony, and goodwill, and so on. And if we take that view towards morality, our view of forgiveness is exactly the same. Forgiveness is appropriate when it promotes harmony among individuals, restores balance and concordance in the relationships between us and those who have wronged us. Okay, so that's stage 5. Stage 6 in the conventional and post-conventional level is, I'm going to mention it, but Kohlberg gave up on it. Kohlberg did his research exclusively, incidentally, with males. Never tested any females. What his methodology was, he developed a series of moral dilemmas, and he simply asked individuals how, he asked individuals, how should the individual described in this moral dilemma respond? What is the appropriate moral behavior? Right? And he would then rate that behavior in terms of where it fell, the reasoning given for the behavior, where did it fall in these levels. And one of the things he found was, well, I'll tell you what stage 6 is. Stage 6 is essentially moral judgments based on personally chosen ethical and moral values. They may be influenced, of course, by what the society around us believes to be appropriate, but they go beyond that because we hold them regardless of whether the society around us agrees with us or not. And so this is like generic harmony, right? The world functions better if we make moral judgments in this way. And at this stage, forgiveness is appropriate because it promotes unconditional love for others, which is a general philosophical value that people at this level very often hold. Now, let me say just in passing that when Kohlberg tested individuals from the ages of 6 or 7 all the way up to 50, 60, 70, he hardly found anybody who reasoned at this 6th level. So in fact, in his modification of his model, he has a scoring system for his moral dilemmas test that I've just mentioned. In the revision of that moral dilemmas test and its scoring system, he eliminates stage 6. Because as far as he's concerned, virtually nobody is in it. Mostly people, incidentally, are in stage 3 or 4, as he tested them. And females are different from males, and that's a whole different research literature we won't get into. So Enright is basing it on the male literature as Kohlberg devised it. Okay, any questions or comments at this point? Okay. Now, just as was the case with gratitude and with several other things, there are associations between personality characteristics, tendencies, and so on, and the trait tendency to be forgiving. And I'm just going to mention a couple of these. You don't need to remember the names of these authors because I'm never going to ask you. But Margaret found, for example, in the mid-90s, that people with high levels of trait forgiveness tend to be less depressed, less anxious, less hostile. I mean, they're in a better mood, basically, people who are more likely to forgive. In the Metz and Kupak study, forgivers are less ruminative. We already talked about that in terms of Worthington's model, right, of unforgiveness and forgiveness. Unforgivers think about it and think about it and rethink about it and turn over the events of the wrong in their head over and over again. Those who forgive eventually move past that. They're less ruminative. Davidson found that forgivers were less self-absorbed, less self-loving, if you like, in the negative sense of the word. And June Tangney and her colleagues found forgivers to be less angry, less hostile, less exploitive, feeling less inadequate, and have higher levels of empathy. And finally, Michael McCullough in the late 90s found forgiveness related positively to agreeableness, one of the big 5 personality factors, and negatively related to neuroticism, again from the big 5. So people who are more forgiving tend to be more, as you might expect, more agreeable, and in a finding that may not be as obvious, less neurotic, less prone to strong negative emotional reactions to things. Okay, so we see that. Now, there are obviously characteristics of the situation, of the transgression, that impact the likelihood that we will respond at any point in a forgiving way towards the person responsible. One of those things, the most obvious things, of course, I think, is the seriousness of the wrong that we have experienced. If someone has done us a wrong that really, 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 really has cost us dearly, the death of a loved one, again, of course, one of the most dramatic cases, then a response of forgiveness is significantly less likely than if the wrong is is less serious, right? I mean, you take, for example, the case of Bernie Madoff and his multi-billion-dollar Ponzi scheme that bankrupted hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people and organizations and destroyed, I mean, almost literally destroyed the lives of many. There are very few people, in fact, I've read no case in which a victim of his scheme has forgiven him. Right? The wrong was simply too great in that case for them to manage it. Another factor that impacts our willingness and ability, perhaps, to forgive is how we understand the intentions of the perpetrator when the wrong occurred. Now, if the individual intended to do us harm, as of course Bernie Madoff did, then of course it becomes much more difficult to forgive that action. If the harm was the unintended consequence of something the person did for another reason, then it becomes easier to forgive. Right? And another very significant factor in determining our likelihood of forgiving is whether or not the individual who's wronged us has recognized the wrong they've done and apologized, said that they were sorry for what has happened. We know this has a tremendous impact on our reaction to trespassers, to transgressors. An apology generally makes us feel less negative towards the offender. If they're sorry, they regret it, then even though we may still be a little angry and maybe a little vengeful, the amount of that has diminished considerably, and our empathy for the other person, our recognition of the anguish they might be feeling is increased. And it sort of, one of the things it does is kind of separate the offender as a person towards whom we might have negative emotions from the offense. Remember, again, this was essentially Roger's view. Love the sinner, hate the sin. It's the same kind of idea here, right? It's interesting. Up until, what was it, 2000? Yeah, 2009. Well, before 2009, if for example, an institution like a hospital would be a classic case, or a doctor, had done something wrong, they'd operated on you in a way that caused you pain, harm, damage, whatever else, an iatrogenic error, which is very common in hospitals, wrong medication, whatever. They never apologized prior to 2009, never. And the reason they didn't was legal. The reason was that apology could be presented in court as evidence of the guilt of the individual, of the responsibility of the individual for what happened. And under that law, even though hospitals in many cases really did want to apologize, they couldn't. Their lawyers would not let them, because it would be an admission of guilt. In 2000, and most of the provinces in Canada did not have that rule, right? In most other provinces, an apology conveyed no information, no prejudicial information about the guilt or innocence of the individual's behavior. So in 2009, recognizing that this was an anomaly, the Ontario legislature passed a rule that said essentially you can't use an apology by someone as evidence of their wrongful behavior. It's simply an apology. And since that time, of course, the number of apologies has skyrocketed, and the number of court cases based on malfeasance and so on has dramatically declined, which is the purpose of the law, right? You want to stay out of court if you possibly can. Everybody does, even the people who've been wronged. But very interesting stuff. Okay, any questions or comments here? Yeah.
They investigated the effect that may have on doctors having the ability to be able to apologize?
Yeah, the main thing it's done, of course, is it reduces the probability that doctors are going to be sued. It's as simple as that. And that is one of the main reasons. And of course, doctors feel bad about these things. They don't want to make these kinds of mistakes. And so they say prior to 2009, they still wanted to make an apology, but they were not allowed to by their insurance providers, of course, who were ultimately going to pay whatever damages were assessed. They couldn't do it. And now they can, and in many cases that leads to either no court case at all or lower settlements and so on, because the families or individuals might be at least more partially or sometimes completely satisfied. I just want him to say he's sorry. Sometimes that's all it takes.
I feel like it may make a difference in the subjective well-being of both.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure it does. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Forgiveness does too. I mean, in the forgiver as well as the forgiven. Absolutely, no question about it. Just as gratitude makes you feel better, not only if you're the recipient of it, but if you're the deliverer of it. Yeah, absolutely, no question. All right, any other questions or comments? All righty. Okay. We've seen in past segments of the course that certain mental states are associated with positive health outcomes. And remarkably, forgiveness is no exception to this, as it happens. There is a relationship, it's not terribly strong, between forgiveness and, this is state forgiveness, so not trait forgiveness, but momentary, situation-specific forgiveness. Lower negative affect and lower levels of psychological symptoms in general. Depressive symptoms in particular in the individual who's been wronged are somewhat less common. This is an interesting one. You've probably heard the term type A personality. These are driven people, go, workaholics. And the concern about their behavior, their type A behavior, is that it puts tremendous stress on the cardiovascular system, right? So they are at much higher risk for high blood pressure, chronic hypertension, and heart attack and other sorts, and stroke, all sorts of cardiovascular incidents. And so to deal with that, individuals who've been identified as type A and at high risk for these things very often get some sort of intervention. One of those interventions is cognitive behavioral therapy to deal with their tendency to be over-aggressive and hostile and so on. And they compared individuals given this CBT to individuals who were given just treatment for their cardiovascular situation, the symptoms, if you like, of the hostility. And what they found was the CBT group showed less hostility. The CBT was more effective than typical traditional cardiovascular treatment. And there was a significant reduction in the CBT group compared with the typical treatment group in the number of complaints, cardiovascular complaints the individuals experienced, I think, in the 6 or 8 months after the treatment. Now, your question here will be, what the heck has this got to do with forgiveness? And the answer is this. When people asked the patients what it was about the CBT that led them to have a positive health outcome, what the majority of them pointed to was their tendency to be more forgiving. Their willingness to forgive others when they screwed up or did something wrong. That increase, what they felt, the patients themselves felt, was the main reason for the improvement in their cardiovascular fitness and outcomes. So there we go. And this is the Whitbleed et al. Study. This is a really interesting one because it actually manipulated forgiveness and looked at the outcome of that manipulation. It's one thing to look at the difference between people who are, if you like, genetically more forgiving and compare their outcomes with those who are genetically less forgiving. The problem is we don't know whether the forgivingness or unforgivingness is responsible for the outcome. It's simply a correlation. Here, we've got an experimental manipulation. What Whitbleed and his colleagues had individuals do, students again, undergraduates, they thought about a transgression that had occurred to them. And then one group was asked to imagine forgiving responses, have forgiving type thoughts about that individual and the transgression. The other group was told or encouraged to have unforgiving thoughts or responses to their transgression. In case they were randomly assigned to each of these conditions, we can assume that they were otherwise identical. And what they found was that the forgivers had lower blood pressure, lower heart rate, lower galvanic skin response, which is a kind of a stress or anxiety reaction, and they had less negative affect as well. They also, and this is a particularly interesting finding, they also felt that they had more control over the situation than those who were asked to have unforgiving responses. They felt more in charge. They felt more autonomous, better able to, they felt that they were in dealing with the situation in ways that demonstrated their control over the circumstances. Okay. Now, I want to look at 2 models of forgiveness, both of which have been used as, what's the word I'm looking for, interventions for people who have suffered transgressions and are having difficulty dealing with them. The first one comes from Robert Enright. And he says, look, if we look at the process of getting from a transgression to forgiveness, we can see a number of different phases that occur, 3 or 4 phases. The first of these he describes as the uncovering phase. And again, he uses this in individual counseling with people who are having trouble dealing with a wrong that has been done to them. And he says, look, the first, in the uncovering phase, people have to recognize and deal with the struggle they've been having with the wrong, the transgression they've experienced. One of the things they will do in this phase is to deal with, how have you been handling dealing with this issue? What are the defenses you've been used to minimize your negative emotions? That is anger and hostility and perhaps self-blame sometimes and so on. You need to recognize and to experience as fully as possible the anger that you feel towards the transgressor, who in this case could be you, but mostly it's someone else. Admitting shame or embarrassment is typically appropriate only when the transgressor is yourself. The person you can't forgive is you. I will never forgive myself for having done X or Y, or not having done X or Y, right? So you're angry, you're shamed, you're embarrassed at the way you've behaved, and now it is you rather than someone else who needs forgiving. You need also, he said, to be aware of how energy draining this whole process is of dealing in this way with the transgression. He actually uses the Freudian term cathexis, right? How much energy have you invested in trying to manage the negative emotions around this transgression? You need to be aware of that and realize at some point it's too much. You're draining yourself of energy that could be put to more productive use elsewhere. A very Freudian idea. You also need to be aware of the fact that you're rehearsing this wrong over and over. You can't get it out of your head. You're ruminating. This is the classic path that we saw Worthington mention in terms of seeing this as a stress reaction, right? And this is Enright's view. Anyway, so you should be aware of the rumination. You also should be aware that you're probably engaging in negative comparisons between you and the perpetrator of the transgression. You know, I've lost, he hasn't lost anything, or in some cases, he's gained. I mean, in the case of Bernie Madoff, you could argue he gained billions while you lost millions, and so on and so forth. You need also to be aware of and explore the way in which your outlook on life and people has changed, perhaps, as a result of this transgression. Are you now less trusting? Are you now more cynical? And have you changed your view about the way in which the world revolves around justice? We talked about the just world hypothesis anyway, but the just world view is the belief that people get what's coming to them, right? Good things tend to happen eventually to good people. Bad things, people who've done bad things will eventually get punished. What goes around comes around is the classic saying, right? And maybe you're no longer so sure of that, given that you're not so well off as the perpetrator and nothing bad has happened to him, right, or her, whatever. Okay, so that's the uncovering phase. The second phase Enright describes as the decision phase. You need to decide what to do here. You've looked over the ways you've been handling things so far, and they haven't been working. We need to recognize that things are not improving. Constantly ruminating and doing all this negative stuff is just not getting you anywhere. You need to decide to do something different. You need to take a different approach. And one of those things you need to consider very, very strongly, of course, in this particular model, is forgiving the offender, right? Forgiving the transgressor. And what we hope this phase will end with is a decision and a commitment. I am going to forgive X for what he or she did to me. All right, so we now have that commitment. In the work phase, what we're going to do is now we're going to rethink the way in which we see the offender. We're going to try and find good things about the offender. We're going to try and develop a sense of empathy and sympathy for the defendant's situation, and so on and so forth. And we should be aware of that increasing compassion towards the person. And eventually we need to accept that we may never feel completely whole. There's always going to be pain around the loss that this transgression has produced. But nevertheless, we have to accept that and move on, move past it, because simply ruminating on it and feeling vengeful is not getting us anywhere that we need to go. Finally, we get to what Enright calls the deepening phase. This is the last part of the process. And so now we kind of step back from the situation, and we try to, remember we talked about creating meaning, especially important when what's happened to us is bad, and this is one of those cases. So now it's time to find the silver lining in the dark cloud, to find things that have changed in a positive way, even as a consequence of a negative action on the part of another, right? What are the things, and can I find larger meaning? Was this meant as a signal from God, whatever it happens to be? All right, so we have the meaning-making process. We also want to realize that while as we forgive others, right, we have ourselves needed forgiveness in the past. Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us, as the Lord's Prayer says. We have too wronged others, and we have too felt the need for forgiveness from others. So it's not like this is a one-way street. And so now we are in a position to do for others what we wanted in the past for ourselves. It's also the case, of course, that we're not the only ones who have been wronged in this way, right? There may be many other people who've suffered similar kinds of losses at the hands of others for whatever reason. And on top of that, there are those who are supporting us. There are those who are there to provide moral and emotional and perhaps other kinds of support as well. We're not facing this on our own. There are resources, human resources in particular, that we can draw on in dealing with this issue. And maybe we'll find a new purpose in life. Maybe we'll find a new life mission as a result of the wrong that has been done to us. And we saw that in the case of Jennifer Thompson and Ronald Cotton. We saw that in the case of Eric, what's his name? I can never remember. And the mother of the murdered, the dead girl. They found new purpose, new meaning in life. They took on tasks that were related to the loss. And we see this happening many times in the case of people who have suffered grievous personal loss at the hands of someone else. They make it a point to, I'm going to raise awareness about X. I'm going to see if I can't raise money to treat Y, whatever it happens to be. We find a new purpose and meaning in our lives as a result of, as a consequence of this negative event. And hopefully that can happen here too. And we need to become aware of the reduced negative feelings we're having and the increased positive feelings we're having. And we should be aware of the release that has occurred. Thank God it's over. I'm done with. I'm past it. I'm released from the prison of having to think about this over and over and over again and dwell on it and ruminate on it and so on. Okay? So, and as I said, this is the way in which Enright deals individually with persons who are struggling with wrongs that have been done to them. Any questions or comments about any of that? Okay. Another intervention developed by Everett Worthington, he's the fellow who had that model about stress and coping and its relation to forgiveness. He calls it the REACH program. This differs from Enright's model that I just showed you in that the REACH program is a group endeavor. All right, so we're looking at people getting together, a number of people, 5, 6, 8 people getting together and working through forgiveness issues in a group context. And each of the letters in the word REACH stands for one of the activities or phases of this intervention process. The first R is recall. And this is very similar to the uncovering phase that we saw in Enright's model. And so what they're going to do is they're going to think about this transgression they've suffered. Stop avoiding it if they've been doing that and denying it. Then we're going to empathize with the transgressor. And the way Worthington has that happen is he has the individual first think about what are the things that could possibly explain the individual's behavior in a way that's less negative, that didn't perhaps intend harm or injury to me. What about the circumstances that required or forced the individual to behave in this way, even though he or she might not have wanted to, and so on. And then to write those down. And typically in the course of, in the context of this group therapeutic process, they would share their writings with the other members of the group who would share theirs with them and so on. If this individual is someone that you've known and had a close relationship with over the years, then another part of this step is to remember the good things about that relationship. Surely if you had a relationship for that long, there are a lot more positives out there to be thought about and thought about as opposed to the negatives. So let's include that in our thinking about the individual who has wronged us. And they also, in some cases, do relaxation exercises, deep breathing exercises, and so on, that will slow down their heart rate and reduce their negative affect to some degree. The A is like the decision phase in Enright's model. This is the altruistic gift of forgiveness. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to decide that I am going to forgive this person, even though he or she doesn't deserve it, they haven't earned it. That's why it's an altruistic gift. This is an undeserved gift from us to that person as a way of getting through this issue. And one way to kind of speed that process up, one way to smooth the way towards that is to, excuse me, is again to remember that we are not without sin on ourselves. That is, we have done things to others for which we would have liked to have been forgiven, for which we have done wrong. And so therefore, it is only appropriate that if that's what we would have liked, that we should be doing that for someone who has wronged us. And again, we remember that how much better we felt when others did, in fact, forgive us for the wrongs we have done to them. And therefore, we can help someone else by forgiving them as well. Okay. C. So in the altruistic gift of forgiveness, we have decided to forgive. We've come to an internal decision, I am going to forgive this individual. In the commitment phase, we are actually going to publicize that decision, that commitment, initially and sometimes only in the context of this group. We will tell the others that we have made this decision, and that's what we're going to do. You might even read a little letter or certificate of forgiveness that we've made up about the individual that we intend to forgive, right? And as I said, we read it in therapy groups. Sometimes, though not always, the individual going through this process will actually deliver that letter, that certificate, that statement of forgiveness to the individual that is the target of the letter. Doesn't always happen, but I mean, it's the most desirable outcome. So it becomes public in the most dramatic possible way. Finally, the last phase, the H in reach, is said to be hold. And what this means is to remain firm in your commitment to be forgiving, to not back off it, because there might be a tendency as time goes by for some of those negative feelings to reemerge and to kind of poison the well as it is. And so what we need to do is make sure that that doesn't happen or minimize the probability that that will happen. And one of the things that will help is realizing that just because you can remember the bad thing that someone has done to you is not the same as being unforgiving. You can still maintain an attitude of forgiveness towards the person even though you haven't forgotten and you are never going to forget the wrong that was done to you. Another suggestion here another process here, is don't return to blocking out any of the emotions, negative or positive, that occur around this issue. You're going to have to deal with them in a straightforward, conscious, logical way, and you can do that without giving up on the forgiveness that you've bestowed on your transgressor. And in fact, there'll be some training in emotion management techniques, in anger management techniques as part of this group process. So that should the time arise when you need to manage negative emotions as they're re-emerging around the person of the transgressor, you will have at least some techniques that will help you do that. And if we see those negative emotions re-emerging, read your letter again. Because in that letter you laid out all the reasons that you were going to forgive and so on and so forth. Read it again, remind yourself of why you've made that commitment and decision and so on. If none of that works, you go back and do the steps again. Start right at the beginning. Again, that's not the usual outcome, but in the case of a very severe transgression, it might be either necessary or desirable. Okay, any questions or comments about any of that? All right, now, if we look at, there are a number of different interventions to promote forgiveness, and several researchers have looked over them and said, look, all of the ones that have demonstrated success in helping people deal with transgressions in a forgiving way, they all have several things in common, 3 things in common in particular. One of those things is they all involve a number of different ways to reduce negative emotions and to reduce unforgiveness. They don't just rely on one process, one phenomenon. A second, and I think this is really the critical one, a second characteristic they all have in common is they involve a commitment on the part of the individual to be forgiving. Making a commitment, making that choice, making that decision, and especially making it public so it's hard to go back on it, is a very important part of every successful intervention on forgiveness. The third characteristic they believed that every single successful intervention had was that it involved the development, the elaboration, the increase of positive emotions, especially empathy and our understanding towards the individual being forgiven. Without that, it's unlikely that a manipulation, an intervention is going to be successful in producing a forgiving response. Several other people have suggested a couple of other characteristics that also are important in producing forgiving. One of them is altruism, the willingness to do something without any return, without recompense, to give selflessly, in this case, give selflessly a forgiving response to others. And hopefully, and of course we saw this in gratitude as well, hopefully generalizing this response of forgiveness so that we are now generally more forgiving in more circumstances to more people for more things. That also can be an important characteristic of successful interventions around forgiveness. Okay. Any final questions? Okay, now that concludes the course. So not only will we not meet next Tuesday, we won't meet this coming Thursday either. Right? I'll be posting this last lecture recording this afternoon, and we are done until the final exam a week from Thursday. I hope that you found one of the things that I really liked about this course in this area is that it's very practical compared with a number of other courses in psychology, which they have some impact and importance in a lot of different areas, but they don't directly speak to perhaps our own needs or desires to improve our life and be better. Positive psychology does. And in many cases it provides guideposts, signposts, directions that we can follow, things that we can do that will improve, at least to some degree and sometimes to a great degree, our chances of experiencing a happier existence. I hope that you all found something in this course that that might fill that requirement, and that if not, you found something of interest, whether or not it was relevant. And I thank you for joining me, and we'll see you again a week from Thursday for the final exam. Take care.